Welcome to Celine Kara Mysteries. Real stories, hidden truths, and secrets waiting to be uncovered. Join Celine as she dives into the mysteries that lie beneath the surface, because every story has a secret, and every secret tells a story. Hello, I'm Celine Kara. As I tell you this story, I can feel my heart beating heavily, because this is a tragic example of how love can transform into a deadly weapon. On the evening of October 15th, Elena sent what would be her final text message: "Looking forward to our coffee tomorrow." She had no idea that in less than 6 hours, she would be dead, and her husband would begin the most elaborate lie of his life. Elena Mocchetti was a 28-year-old Italian translator living in a small coastal town in Antalya. She had grown up with fairy tales brought by her grandmother from Sicily, and the romantic novels she devoured during long summer afternoons had shaped her life. Her auburn hair shone in the Mediterranean sunlight, while her infectious laughter echoed through the narrow streets of the old quarter. She had met Murat 3 years ago at a local art gallery opening. He was 35, a successful construction contractor with kind eyes and a gentle smile that made her heart skip a beat. Murat spoke softly, moved with deliberate care, and treated Elena like precious porcelain. Their courtship had been straight out of a fairy tale: romantic dinners overlooking the turquoise coast, weekend trips to hidden coves, and whispered promises under star-filled skies. Their wedding had been the talk of the small coastal community. Elena wore her grandmother's vintage lace dress, and Murat looked handsome in his navy suit as they exchanged vows in the ancient stone church overlooking the sea. Friends and family celebrated late into the night, dancing to a mix of traditional Turkish music and Italian folk songs brought by Elena's relatives from Sicily. But behind the picture-perfect facade, cracks had begun to form. Elena worked as a translator for the local tourism board, her fluent Turkish, Italian, and English making her invaluable during the busy summer season. She loved her independence, the intellectual stimulation of her work, and the diverse people she met daily. Murat, however, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with his wife's professional life. He would make subtle comments about her long hours, question why she needed to attend evening networking events, and suggest that perhaps it was time for them to start a family. What Elena didn't know was that Murat's construction business was failing. Economic pressures had been mounting for months. Several major projects had fallen through. He had taken loans he couldn't repay, made promises to investors he couldn't keep, and watched his carefully built reputation crumble. The stress was eating him alive, but his pride prevented him from sharing his struggles with Elena. As autumn approached in 2023, their conversations became shorter, their dinners quieter, and their embraces felt more like obligations than expressions of love. Elena noticed the change but attributed it to the natural rhythm of marriage settling into routine. She tried to rekindle their connection with surprise dinners and weekend getaways, but Murat seemed distant, lost in thoughts he refused to share. Neighbors in their small apartment building later recalled hearing raised voices occasionally, though they couldn't make out specific words. Mrs. Sevi from upstairs mentioned seeing Elena crying on their balcony one evening, staring out at the sea as if searching for answers in the endless horizon. Elena's best friend, Francesca, a fellow Italian expat who ran a small boutique in the town center, had grown worried about Elena's increasingly subdued demeanor. During their weekly coffee meetings, Elena would force smiles and deflect questions about her marriage with practiced ease. But Francesca knew her friend too well to be fooled by surface appearances. The last conversation they had was on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. Elena had stopped by the boutique after work, her usual vibrant energy replaced by a quiet melancholy that broke Francesca's heart. She mentioned that Murat had been working late more frequently, that their communication had become superficial, and that she felt like she was living with a stranger. Elena confided that she had discovered some financial documents hidden in Murat's desk drawer, loan agreements and overdue payment notices that painted a picture of severe financial distress. When she had gently approached him about it, Murat had exploded with anger, accusing her of snooping and violating his privacy. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly angry, and it had frightened her. As September faded into October, Elena made a decision that would ultimately seal her fate. She decided to confront Murat directly about their problems, to demand honesty and transparency in their marriage. She believed that love could conquer any obstacle, that open communication could heal any wound. She had no idea that her husband had already crossed a line from which there would be no return. October 15, 2023, started like any other day in the coastal town. Elena woke early, as was her habit, and prepared Turkish tea and fresh borek for breakfast. The morning air carried the salt scent of the sea, and golden sunlight streamed through their kitchen window. She had made a mental decision the night before. Today would be the day she and Murat had an honest conversation about their marriage. Murat sat at the breakfast table, scrolling through his phone with mechanical precision. His dark hair was disheveled, and the circles under his eyes had deepened over the past weeks. Elena studied his profile, remembering the man who used to look up when she entered a room, whose face would light up at the sight of her smile. She told him that they needed to talk that evening, that she couldn't continue living in the emotional distance that had grown between them. Murat's response was a non-committal grunt, his attention still fixed on his phone screen. Elena felt a familiar pang of frustration mixed with sadness, but she was determined to break through the wall he had built around himself. Her day at the tourism office was productive but emotionally draining. She translated documents for a hotel renovation project, conducted a phone interview with an Italian journalist writing about Turkish coastal culture, and attended a brief meeting about upcoming winter tourism initiatives. Throughout it all, she rehearsed in her mind what she would say to Murat that evening. Colleagues later remembered Elena seeming unusually contemplative that day. Her supervisor, Kamal, mentioned that she had asked for the next day off, saying she needed time to handle some personal matters. When pressed gently about whether everything was all right, Elena had simply smiled and said that she hoped it would be. At 6:30 p.m., Elena arrived home to find Murat already there, which was unusual. He was sitting in their living room, staring out at the darkening sea. The apartment felt heavy with unspoken tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. Elena prepared dinner, grilled sea bass with roasted vegetables, one of Murat's favorite meals. She hoped the familiar comfort of good food might create an atmosphere conducive to honest conversation. They ate in relative silence, the only sounds being the gentle clinking of cutlery against plates and the distant sound of waves against the rocky shore below their building. After dinner, Elena finally broached the subject that had been weighing on her heart for weeks. She told Murat that she felt like they were becoming strangers, that the man she had married seemed to have disappeared. She mentioned the financial documents she had discovered, expressing her desire to help and support him through whatever difficulties he was facing. What happened next would haunt the investigation for months to come. According to Murat's eventual confession, Elena's words triggered something dark within him. The shame of his financial failures, the fear of losing respect in their community, and the pressure of maintaining a facade of success had been building like steam in a pressure cooker. Elena's gentle attempts to help felt like accusations to his wounded pride. He told her things he later claimed he never meant to say. He revealed the full extent of his business failures, the debts that threatened to destroy everything they had built together, and his fear that she would leave him once she understood the magnitude of their problems. Elena's response was compassion. She reached out to touch his hand, telling him that they would face whatever came together, as partners. But Murat's emotional state had already spiraled beyond reason. In his confession months later, he would describe feeling like a trapped animal, convinced that Elena's knowledge of his failures would inevitably lead to his complete humiliation. The rational part of his mind that recognized her love and support was overwhelmed by panic, shame, and a desperate desire to make the problem disappear. The argument escalated when Elena suggested they seek counseling, perhaps take a break from the financial pressures by staying with her cousin in Italy for a few weeks. To Murat, this sounded like running away, like admitting defeat in front of Elena's family who had never fully approved of their marriage. Neighbors later reported hearing raised voices around 9:30 p.m., followed by a period of silence that stretched past midnight. Mrs. Sevi from the upstairs apartment mentioned hearing what sounded like furniture being moved, though she thought little of it at the time. The exact sequence of events that night remained unclear until Murat's confession, but the outcome was tragically simple. In a moment of rage and desperation that he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand, Murat committed an act that destroyed 2 lives forever. Elena, who had woken that morning hoping to save her marriage, would never see another sunrise. The first person to notice Elena's absence was Francesca. When Elena failed to appear for their regular Wednesday morning coffee at Marina Cafe, Francesca initially assumed her friend was simply running late. But as the morning stretched into afternoon with no word, worry began to gnaw at her. Francesca tried calling Elena's cell phone repeatedly, but each call went straight to voicemail. Elena's cheerful recorded voice promising to return calls soon felt like a mockery of the growing anxiety that twisted in Francesca's stomach. By 3 p.m., she decided to visit Elena's apartment building. She found Murat in the lobby, carrying a large duffel bag toward his car. His appearance startled her. His usually neat hair was messy, his clothes wrinkled, and his eyes held a wild, unfocused quality she had never seen before. When Francesca asked about Elena, Murat's response was stilted and strange. He told Francesca that Elena had decided to visit her cousin in Milan unexpectedly. She had received a phone call late the night before about a family emergency and had left on the first flight that morning. Murat explained that Elena had been in such a hurry that she hadn't had time to call Francesca or anyone else. The story felt wrong in ways Francesca couldn't immediately articulate. Elena was methodical about travel plans, always booking flights weeks in advance and never making impulsive decisions. More importantly, Elena would never leave without telling Francesca, especially not when they had plans to meet. When Francesca asked why Elena hadn't taken her phone, Murat's explanation became even more convoluted. He claimed that Elena had dropped her phone and cracked the screen badly the night before, making it unusable. She had decided to buy a new one in Milan and would call everyone once she was settled. That evening, Francesca contacted Elena's cousin Marco in Milan. The conversation confirmed her worst fears. Marco had received no emergency calls, had no knowledge of Elena's supposed visit, and hadn't heard from her in over a month. Elena was not in Milan, had never planned to go to Milan, and was quite simply nowhere to be found. The next morning, Francesca contacted the local police. Officer Emre Ozkan, a veteran of the small coastal town's police force, initially treated Elena's disappearance as a routine missing person case. Adults had the right to travel without informing everyone of their whereabouts, and marital problems sometimes led to impulsive departures. But Francesca's insistence that something was terribly wrong, combined with the inconsistencies in Murat's story, prompted a more serious investigation. When officers visited the apartment building, they found Murat in the midst of what he described as deep cleaning their home. The apartment was spotless to an almost obsessive degree. Every surface gleamed, every piece of furniture was perfectly arranged, and the air held the sharp scent of industrial-strength cleaning products. Murat explained that he was dealing with stress through cleaning, that keeping busy helped him cope with Elena's sudden departure. Days passed and the situation grew increasingly complex. The local police team was at a loss. Elena's family and Francesca felt they needed someone more experienced to solve the case. That's when I stepped in. I'm Celine Kara. 4 years, there hasn't been a mystery I couldn't solve. Elena's family reached out to me, knowing me through my TV shows, books, and successful cases. Giuseppe wanted justice for his sister Elena and felt the local authorities were inadequate. When I arrived in Antalya, my first task was to re-examine all the evidence from the beginning. The inconsistencies in Murat's story were very clear to me. During his initial formal interviews, his story about Elena's departure had changed in subtle but significant ways. The timing of the supposed emergency call had shifted from late evening to early morning. The reason for the trip had evolved from a family emergency to a personal crisis that Elena's cousin was experiencing. Most tellingly, Murat couldn't provide any verifiable details about Elena's departure. He didn't know which airline she had supposedly taken, couldn't remember the exact time of her flight, and had no documentation of her travel plans. When asked why he hadn't driven Elena to the airport, Murat claimed she had preferred to take a taxi, though no taxi company in the area had any record of an early morning pickup from their address. I deepened the investigation, meeting one by one with Elena's colleagues, friends, and family members. The investigation team allowed me to examine Elena's social media accounts, emails, and phone records. Her last text message had been sent to Francesca at 7:15 p.m. on October 15th, a simple "looking forward to our coffee tomorrow." There had been no posts, no communications with family in Italy, and no digital footprint suggesting travel preparations. As the days passed, I began monitoring Murat's behavior and saw that it was becoming increasingly erratic. He gave multiple media interviews, pleading for Elena's safe return and expressing his deep love for his missing wife. But his performances felt rehearsed, his emotions seemed manufactured, and his details about their last evening together continued to shift and change. When I spoke with friends and neighbors, they began to recall strange details from recent weeks. Mrs. Sevi mentioned that she had heard furniture being moved late on the night Elena disappeared, followed by the sound of Murat's car starting and leaving the building around 2 a.m. The building's parking garage security camera had mysteriously malfunctioned that same night, showing only static during the crucial hours. These details aroused my suspicions. I began to focus more intensively on Murat, treating him not as a grieving husband but as the prime suspect in his wife's disappearance. 3 weeks after Elena's disappearance, the investigation had reached a critical juncture. I had assembled a comprehensive timeline of inconsistencies in Murat's statements, while forensic experts had begun finding traces of evidence that contradicted his story of Elena's voluntary departure. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Elena's phone, which Murat claimed had been damaged and discarded, was discovered by a fisherman in the waters near the coastal cliffs, about 15 kilometers from their apartment building. The phone had been weighted down with rocks in what appeared to be a deliberate attempt to dispose of evidence. This discovery was a major clue for me. I ensured that digital forensics experts managed to recover data from the water-damaged device. Elena's last text message to Francesca had indeed been sent at 7:15 p.m. on October 15, but the phone's location data revealed a troubling pattern. The device had remained in the apartment until approximately 1:45 a.m. on October 16, then had traveled along the coastal highway to the remote cliff area where it was eventually discovered. This timeline completely contradicted Murat's claim that Elena had left for the airport early that morning. More damning still, cell tower data showed that Murat's phone had followed the exact same route at the same time, definitively placing him at the disposal site. When confronted with this evidence, Murat's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. I arranged a formal interrogation. The interrogation room felt sterile and harsh under fluorescent lights. Initially, Murat continued to insist on his innocence. He claimed that Elena must have left her phone behind when she departed, and that his own late-night drive was simply an attempt to clear his head. But as I methodically presented each piece of evidence, his resolve began to weaken. The forensic team had found microscopic traces of Elena's blood in their apartment, despite Murat's extensive cleaning efforts. Luminol tests revealed spatter patterns consistent with violence in their living room. Additionally, chemical analysis of the cleaning products found in the apartment showed they were specifically designed to eliminate biological evidence. My most important discovery was revealing that Murat had purchased a tarp, rope, and heavy-duty garbage bags from a hardware store on October 14, one day before Elena's disappearance. This discovery became the key that solved the case. As the evidence mounted, Murat's story continued to evolve. But each new version of events contradicted physical evidence and witness statements, making his guilt increasingly undeniable. The final breaking point came when I learned that his phone had been monitored and his conversations with his brother in Istanbul had been recorded. In these calls, Murat had discussed cleaning up the mess and had asked for money to disappear for a while. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the collapse of every alibi, Murat finally began to tell the truth. The confession session lasted over 8 hours, and I patiently documented every detail of that terrible night. Murat described how Elena's attempts to help with his financial problems had triggered a psychological breakdown. He admitted that her love and support had felt like pity to his damaged ego, that her practical suggestions had seemed like criticism of his failures as a provider. In his distorted mental state, he had convinced himself that Elena would eventually leave him anyway. The argument had escalated when Elena suggested they sell their apartment and move somewhere less expensive while he rebuilt his business. To Murat, this felt like the final humiliation. In a moment of rage that he claimed to barely remember, he had struck Elena during their argument. Elena had fallen, hitting her head on the corner of their coffee table. Murat described a moment of horrific clarity when he realized what he had done, followed by panic when he checked for signs of life and found none. The most chilling aspect of his confession was the calculated nature of his actions after Elena's death. This wasn't a crime of passion followed by remorse, but a deliberate attempt to escape consequences through deception and manipulation. When Murat finished his confession, I felt a mixture of satisfaction at solving the case and profound sadness for Elena's unnecessary death. Justice was finally within reach, but Elena would never come home. The aftermath of Murat Ozkan's confession sent shockwaves through the small coastal community where Elena and Murat had seemed like the perfect couple. As news of the arrest spread, neighbors and friends struggled to reconcile the gentle, soft-spoken man they thought they knew with the calculated killer he had revealed himself to be. Murat was immediately arrested and charged with premeditated murder. Despite his claims that Elena's death was the result of a heated argument, the evidence of his advanced preparation pointed to a more sinister truth. The prosecution would argue that Murat had been planning Elena's murder for days, if not weeks. The most heartbreaking aspect of the case remained unresolved. Elena's body had not been recovered. The Mediterranean waters where Murat claimed to have disposed of his wife were deep and treacherous, with strong currents that could have carried Elena's remains far from the disposal site. Despite extensive searches involving Coast Guard vessels, professional divers, and underwater sonar equipment, Elena's body remained lost to the sea. For Elena's family, this absence of closure added an extra layer of torment to their grief. Her parents, Giuseppe and Maria, had traveled from Sicily to Turkey as soon as they learned of their daughter's disappearance. They remained in the coastal town throughout the investigation and trial, desperately hoping that Murat would provide more specific details about where Elena could be found. The trial began in the spring of 2024, 6 months after Elena's murder. The courthouse in Antalya was packed with journalists, legal observers, and members of the expatriate Italian community who had embraced Elena as one of their own. I was also present at the trial as a witness and described my investigation process. Perhaps the most devastating testimony came from Francesca, Elena's best friend, who described the vibrant, loving woman who had been stolen from the world. Through tears, Francesca recounted Elena's hopes for her marriage, her willingness to support Murat through his difficulties, and her plans for their future together. Elena's colleagues from the tourism office testified about her professionalism, her love for her work, and her pride in building a life in Turkey. The defense's attempts to generate sympathy for Murat fell flat in the face of evidence showing his calculated behavior after Elena's death. His television interviews pleading for his wife's safe return were replayed in court, revealing them to be cynical performances designed to deflect suspicion. On a cloudy day in June 2024, exactly 8 months after Elena's murder, the jury delivered their verdict. Murat Özkan was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As Murat was led away in handcuffs, Giuseppe stood and addressed the court. Speaking in accented but clear Turkish, he thanked the investigators, prosecutors, and judicial system for their dedication to finding justice for Elena. Justice had been found for Elena, but the most painful truth remained unresolved: Elena's body could not be found. In the months following the trial, Elena's story resonated far beyond the small Turkish coastal town where she had lived and died. Her case became a symbol of domestic violence hidden behind facades of respectability, and advocacy groups used her story to promote awareness about the warning signs of dangerous relationships. After this case, I gave many conferences to raise awareness about similar situations. Elena's story showed me that sometimes even the most gentle-seeming people can hide the darkest secrets. The Italian consulate established the Elena Mocchetti Memorial Fund, providing support for expatriate women experiencing domestic violence. Elena's former workplace created an annual scholarship in her name for young women studying translation and international relations. These tributes ensured that Elena's legacy would be one of helping others, even in death. Francesca eventually returned to Italy, unable to continue living in the place where her best friend had been murdered. Before leaving, she scattered flowers in the Mediterranean waters where Elena's body was believed to rest, promising to carry her friend's memory wherever life took her. The search for Elena's remains continued sporadically, funded by her family and supported by volunteer organizations. Giuseppe returned to Turkey every few months, walking the coastal cliffs and coordinating with local authorities in the never-ending quest to bring his sister home. This case was one of the most difficult cases in my career. Elena's story was a tragic reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, that love and trust can be weaponized by those willing to exploit them. But it also demonstrated the power of persistent investigation, the importance of community support for victims, and the ultimate triumph of truth over deception. Elena believed in fairy tales, but her story ended not with happily ever after, but with a community's promise that her life would not be forgotten and that justice, however delayed, would ultimately prevail. In the end, perhaps that is the most important fairy tale of all, the belief that truth and justice will always find a way to shine through the darkness. This was Elena's story. And I, Celine Kara, did everything I could to keep her memory alive. Because every story has a secret, and every secret tells a story.